Okay, so Pokemon Sun and Moon are literally some of my favorite games of all time. They mean a lot to me, mostly because they were some of the very first JRPGs I really connected with. They have some really nice vibes, and in general, just a really good and engaging story. Okay, I played some JRPGs before that, but number one, I wasn't really good at English back in the day, and number two, most of them just weren't very focused on story. That includes previous Pokemon games that usually just wanted you to get along with your adventure and really didn't focus on the characters and the dialogue in the same way that Pokemon Sun and Moon ended up doing. Even the wallpaper for my recently purchased smartband is literally just trying to mimic a Z-Ring from those games. But in 2017, 1 year after Pokemon Sun and Moon released, we got Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. They were announced a little bit before that, and I remember when that happened, I was actually really excited, because they were initially presented as quote-unquote alternate reality sequels. Sun and Moon's story dealt quite a bit with some alternate dimension stuff, and the implication here was that these game stories would, instead of being just an upgraded version, like Pokemon Platinum or Pokemon Crystal for example, they would be more like sequels that just happen to take place at the same time in a different sort of reality or dimension and whatnot. To give y'all some reference on the state of Pokemon extra versions at the time, you have to remember that the previous two generations did not have any sort of like upgraded versions, with Black and White having Black and White 2, which are sequels, and X and Y just having nothing at all. Pokemon Z was rumored, but it never really happened. So, from the announcement, and with the precedent set by Generation 5, we were sort of expecting that this would be less of just an updated version and more of its own thing, and that was really promising. But then when they came out, it turned out they really were just enhanced versions. You know, it's your Pokemon Emeralds, it's the definitive third version, but now split into two because why the hell not? Frankly, the mere existence of these games hits as a bit greedy, especially with the whole alternate reality sequel thing, and the fact that there's still two versions despite all the other enhanced Pokemon releases being just one extra third version. And also, this is a 3DS. The 3DS supports DLC, guys. There's no reason, besides wanting money, for you to make extra content for Sun and Moon that is not just DLC. Like, come on. And this is reflected in the game's title because it can actually mean two things. The Ultra in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon could either mean Ultra in the literal sense, where it means like, you know, the souped up definitive version of Pokemon Sun and Moon. It's the Ultra, powered up, complete, fully charged, whatever, version of Sun and Moon. But it could also refer to the Ultra Beasts, which are these Pokemon from a different dimension that are pretty important in both of these releases, but especially in Ultra Sun and Moon. And the implication of the former would basically be that these are just the definitive versions of the games, enhanced in every way and basically superannuating the originals. But the implications of the latter interpretations lean more on the alternate reality sequel thing that we talked about. A completely different story, focusing more on alternate dimension shenanigans and the Ultra Beasts. But I think the game doesn't commit enough to either of these interpretations. Cause when I played Ultra Sun and Moon on release, it was genuinely so boring, especially amongst the Switch hype. Lots of insanely cool Nintendo Switch games were coming out, and there I was, playing effectively the same game from last year on a Nintendo 3DS. There are definitely changes to spot, but the bulk of the game is effectively the same. One of the biggest flaws with the original Sun and Moon was how, due to the focus on story, as well as the game's tendency to hold the player's hand and tutorialize everything, it has some really long text walls and unskippable cutscenes that can get really boring, especially on a second playthrough. And this kinda just exacerbates that issue, because here they are, asking you to replay the same game from last year with minimal changes, and it happens to be the Pokemon game with the longest, most drawn-out cutscenes that are impossible to skip. I imagine this must have been hell for competitive players back in the day, because they are basically forced to replay these games if they want to get all the new Pokemon that are, you know, basically required to play within the competitive metagame. Sun and Moon is the kind of game you play once every few years to relive the story, best taken in moderation, since the story is so impactful and can give you a lot of lasting memories. It's way better to replay them after a longer period of time when you've matured. I actually did this a few years back. I realized it's been a good while since I last played Sun and Moon. Why don't I replay it now that I'm a bit more mature and I can see what I missed from the story originally? And I learned a lot of stuff. I really focused on all the dialogue and really tried to immerse myself in the experience, and it was a great time. Even though I had already played these games in the past, playing these games that I grew up with more mature, experienced eyes, really felt great. I can't say the same for being forced to play these games only a year after they came out. I love the cutscenes in the first playthrough, but don't make me go through it all again so soon. Okay, but if it's so similar, then it's clearly taking the definitive version route, right? No! The story changes quite a bit at points, and there's tons of fake outs for people who have played the originals. Lots of little changes and little haha gotcha moments for people who were expecting the same things from the original to happen again. The big change everyone talks about is of course Lucamine's Lily's mom's character arc. Lots of folks really take issue with it. She's no longer really evil, just unhealthily obsessive. A lot of people actually argue that the new story stuff is in fact interesting and in line with Lucamine's characterization because it focuses on different stuff, basically reinforcing that even though Lucamine was basically the villain in the original game, that was due to unhealthy obsession more than anything, and if you just change what she's obsessed about, your perspective on the events becomes totally different, which is an interesting different take, and I can understand that, but to me it just doesn't work as a substitute to the originals. Base Sun and Moon had a very particular theme about identity and standing up for oneself. Lily was basically the main character. Interrupting that arc to focus on some out there multiverse stuff for the last 10% of the game is kind of jarring and inconclusive if you ask me. To me, you just didn't experience Sun and Moon if you did not see the original's final portion. You'd be missing out on some of the best stuff about the story. In a way, it kind of feels disrespectful to the OGs, especially when they're kind of in a way selling themselves as definitive versions. And it also kind of raises the question of what even is canon anymore. I know canon in Pokemon is weird because inherently most of the games already have like 2 different versions at least, which leads to 2 different timelines. But since there are tons of like really radical changes to the story in these games, just makes me kind of unsure as to what to believe, right? Because I got attached to Lily's character arc in the original, and by the end where she goes off to Kanto to become her own trainer, it's really touching and it really feels like it has an impact. As a kid, and I know this would never happen, I would dream of a day where we would get a future Pokemon game and we would see like an adult version of Lily where she's all trained up and stuff and matured because she went to Kanto and whatnot. But if Gladion goes to Kanto instead, which is what happens in Ultra Sun and Moon, suddenly the entire narrative changes, the entire outcome would change. Lucamine doesn't really have to treat herself in the same way anymore, it's different. It's suddenly a different story, right? But not enough of a different story to justify itself. It makes me unsure as to just what to believe, right? I'll personally cling on to the original because that's the story that meant the most to me, and continuing my life and even like my interpretation of the Pokemon world after that honestly makes me feel a little bit better about it. But I don't know, maybe someday Gladion will appear in a future game and he'll be like, oh yeah, I went to Kanto that one time, and suddenly sure, I guess everything that happened in Sun and Moon, including all those beautiful scenes with Lily, just didn't happen. Sure, whatever. Don't get me wrong, Ultra Sun and Moon does add a ton of really good stuff. From a gameplay perspective, it adds extra features like Mantine surfing, which is really fun, as well as the hunt for the Ultra Beast in the post-game, all the little details and extra events that they add. The difficulty is higher, which is generally speaking always a good thing for Pokemon games if you ask me. Improved graphics, really cool post-game with the Rainbow Rocket stuff, and some really neat story beats. While I might not really be happy with how the story itself ultimately panned out, a lot of the moments in the new stuff that Ultra Sun and Moon added are really cool. Fighting the Necrozma in the final boss is awesome. Seeing the Ultra Raccoon Squad, getting the new forms for Necrozma, all that is rad. And I would love to see that in some other way included within the Sun and Moon story. But to me, all these additions are included in a way that just kind of compromises the original experiences too much. I can't really in my right mind recommend this to a first-time player. They've been missing out on so much of what Sun and Moon is and what it means. And I think you're starting to see the issue here. Because ultimately the big issue here is that Ultra Sun and Moon is too similar to the originals to be a flat-out sequel or completely alternate take, but too different to be a definitive edition who just overtakes the original in all aspects. Basically, who is this game for, right? Because people who already played the originals are gonna be bored by the tons of similar dialogue and the kind of frustrating story changes. And people who didn't are gonna be missing out on a ton of what makes Sun and Moon, Sun and Moon. In my head, there exists a definitive version of Sun and Moon somewhere out in the multiverse. I'd love to have a version of this game that basically maintains most of what makes the original story itself, its meaning, its big moments, and all the cool stuff it has and carries, but also adds all the new features, tons of the new events, and everything else that Ultra Sun and Moon added that's pretty cool. Down to the freaking Z-Ring design. I literally prefer how it looks in Ultra Sun and Moon to the originals. Of course, tons of the story things from Ultra Sun and Moon would have to be recontextualized, maybe put as post-game, and be given a different justification to exist. You can't literally have both games coexist because the stories overtake each other at one point. But there are definitely ways around that to make most of what's new in Ultra Sun and Moon kind of fit in the original story in one way or another. If I had the skills to make this game myself, I definitely would try to. Hackers get around to it. Alternatively, this could all have not been a problem if they were actually just alternate sequels. Before the Ultra games came out, I had this idea in my head that by the end, they could possibly just read your save file from the original games, make it so the protagonist you customize from that version pops into an Ultra wormhole or something, writing the legendary, right, and helping you out in the story or something. Make it about multiverses, that would be sick. Or they could have actually just folded and made the new stuff DLC, kind of basically creating that definitive version I talked about. Back in the day, there were rumors of Pokémon Stars on Switch, which would be the third definitive version to Pokémon Sun and Moon. The big difference here, of course, is that it wouldn't be on 3DS anymore, it would be on Nintendo Switch, kind of as a light, sort of updated remaster for a concurrent console. And a lot of the same issues would still apply, but at least the game would justify its own existence a little more, because then we have a version that's HD, it's on this home console that's also portable, and maybe they would just not mess with the story as much. There's no denying that I love all of the Alola games, including Ultra to some extent, and together they make a delicious Alolan pie. But the thing is, you can't really take them together, but you can't really take them by themselves. It's really hard to get into. As someone who pushed through Ultra Sun and Moon and came out getting all the new stuff, I definitely agree that some of the new stuff has a lot of worth and is really cool or really interesting. But I wish it wasn't at the cost of the originals. The experience of going through these games in sequence just isn't the best. I think a lot of the ideas in Ultra Sun and Moon work great for a deliberate Sun and Moon Gaiden. An alternate, but not necessarily better take that's supposed to complement the originals, not overtake them. Imagine if the story started the same, but it slowly derailed into its own crazy thing by the halfway point, serving as a cool fake out for people who played the originals. Kinda like how the new Scott Pilgrim show has the main character die after the first episode. Everyone was expecting a remake, but no! It's a completely different story. Ultra Sun and Moon's story does change eventually, but it's too little too late. Do more with it, experiment more, give me a whole new story, make this kind of a sequel. That would have been so cool. Ultra Sun and Moon is ultimately unable, or just afraid of committing to being mostly an original story. And I guess I can only hope that someday we'll get a definitive version. Heck, I'd love to visit Alola again no matter what. Thanks for watching.